Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Learning Stack. Today, I'm delighted to be chatting with Dr. Katie Davis, Associate Professor at the University of Washington and Director of the UW Digital Youth Lab. Katie's work focuses on the impact of digital technologies on young people's learning, development, and well-being. Her latest book, Technology's Child: Digital Media's Role in the Ages and Stages of Growing Up, was published in September 2023, and you can pick it up on your preferred book purchasing site. I'm partial to thrift books myself. However, it is cheaper on Amazon than it is on thrift books. They're not a sponsor of the show or anything like that. Anyway, Katie, thank you for joining me.
Well, thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
We'll start with the easy questions. Are we overestimating the role of technology in shaping youth behavior at the expense of traditional social forces like parenting, peer pressure, and economic class?
Oh, yeah, that's an easy one. To start off with an easy question. Um, I've been researching the role of technology in different aspects of young people's lives for 20 years now. I can't believe it. And before that, I was an elementary school teacher. So I've been around kids for a long time, and their environments. And yeah, observing conversations that are going on in education, as well as consuming the research and also doing a lot of the research myself. Um, you know, I, it is true that we put a lot of weight on technology. We put a lot of our hopes and fears. I think we project onto new technologies. Um, and often, there's a very clear pattern, if you look at the history of educational technology and how it is introduced into schools. Usually there's a lot of fanfare, there's a lot of excitement, often a lot of trepidation when a new technology comes around. And then gradually, and this is something that my friend and colleague at MIT, Justin Reich, describes really well in his book, Failure to Disrupt. Often, what happens is that instead of totally disrupting what happens in school and how kids learn and how teachers teach, often what happens instead is that the technology gets domesticated, it gets tamed by the structure of school. And so often we see, these waves of new technology come, and really, if you step into a classroom today, it would look pretty familiar to a classroom that you stepped in 10, 20, 30 years ago. Um, so yeah, I don't know that that answers your question directly, but definitely just setting the stage for, we think that always when a new technology is coming, it's going to just change everything. And it rarely does. Although I do have to say that with generative AI, it's such a general purpose technology that it does seem to have, some potential to really change things, I think, unlike other technologies that we've seen in recent years.
We'll continue to probe around that question. Easy was a total joke.
Yeah.
So, as you stated, you've researched youth and technology for nearly 20 years and the intersection between those two. What first sparked your interest in the field?
Well, it was really as a teacher. So I was one of those kids who I was just telling my friend this actually over the weekend. I was always one of those kids when a friend came over, we would have to play school, and I was always the teacher. So I always wanted to be a teacher, and I always wanted to be a writer. I feel like as an academic, I kind of do both of those things now. But I started off my career as a fourth grade teacher, and this was the early to mid 2000s. And the technology landscape back then looked very, very different from the current landscape. But what was becoming very obvious is that technology was rapidly introduced into the classroom and also into kids' everyday lives. I was being asked as a teacher more and more to use different software on the computer to assess my students in reading and math, to give them extra activities for the high flyers, to help those who are struggling, to kind of um, tailor lessons for them using different software. And so I was just becoming very interested back then in what does this mean for the future of learning and teaching and just in general how young people are developing in this world and their sense of their place in it. And so that was really what drove me to go back to graduate school and pursue my doctorate. I was really fortunate, I think, in the timing of all this because I started my doctorate in 2005. So Facebook was still very, very new. MySpace, I think, had probably peaked by then. The iPhone hadn't come out yet. Instagram was not a thing, but it was all these things were about to come online, and so it's just really interesting as a graduate student. All of these new changes in technology just really changed how young people were interacting with each other and how they were expressing themselves, and so that's really what got me interested. And I think I've just since technology is always changing, it's always fertile ground for research.
And I guess to that point, uh, what have you observed as kind of major shifts in how we think about digital media and its impact on how young people learn and develop over time? How has the conversation shifted? Maybe the kinds of things we're concerned about have changed. Like what are those major trends over the last 20 years?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that has stayed quite consistent is just general fear. When I first started this work, right from the beginning, I was doing a lot of workshops with parents and teachers, and I still do that work. Um, and I hear the same level of fear, even though the technologies have changed. And even I would say probably the fear has amplified, but just the fear of the unknown, how the children's experiences right now look so different from ours did when we were kids, and there's that instills a lot of fear of the unknown. So I think that is a consistent. But what has changed, I've noticed, is back when I first started doing this research, it was more, should kids have access to technology or not, or certain technologies and not? And now it's there's more of a recognition that yeah, that it's kind of impossible to have a tech-free childhood. I mean, to some extent. Um, Now I think the question has more shifted towards when should children use technologies for what kinds of learning tasks or what kinds of entertainment tasks, and which kinds of technologies are better than others. So I think, that shift towards should they or shouldn't they, towards when and what kinds of experiences should they be having, um, that's, I think, a big shift that I've seen. But that fear, that is ever present. That's been a real constant in my work and conversations with parents and teachers.
I mean, that tracks historically as well. The printing press, radio, television, all of these technological
Absolutely.
innovations, they kind of an accompanying social reaction, perhaps against them, perhaps related to some fear as to a tradition of thought or a mode of being that is now lost to that technology. Are those arguments more compelling when you see technologies like generative AI, which are kind of more generalist tools, or less compelling? Where do you stand on these kinds of fears?
Well, I think it's important to pay attention to them. Um, it's true, with every period of time, historical period, we have a different way of being in the world depending on the technologies that we interact with on a daily basis, and also, of course, what else is going on in the world, and just sort of the zeitgeist that's of your cultural context. um, and so our experience of being in this world in the early 19th century is going to be different from the 21st century, of course. And I think that it's worth reflecting on, what ways of being are we giving up, but also what ways of being are we opening up and making possible. I guess I personally take the perspective of, sure, it's from a historical perspective, it's very interesting to document shifts into new ways of being. And so from that perspective, I'm very interested in what we're giving up. But I tend to be more of an optimist, I guess, and I'm excited about what new ways of being are made possible. But I think just being reflective and aware of these shifts is valuable and important. And perhaps, in a lot of academics in technology, studying technology, a lot of them are obviously very pro technology, pro innovation, and sometimes are very quick to dismiss the fears. But I think, really listening to what's underneath those fears is worthwhile, because ultimately I think it does have to do with, you know, saying goodbye to certain ways of being in the world that, maybe we are sad to give up. But, there's always a positive side as well.
In engaging these shifts that technologies may exacerbate or cause, we like to have kind of it seems like we like to have these kind of handy metrics for judging them. Like with smartphones, we're talking about screen time, or you know maybe some people may judge themselves based on follower counts on social media or something like this. Do we feel like these challenges that we talk about today, screen time, social media, etc., are fundamentally new, or are they new expressions of issues that have always been part of growing up, like finding identity or community, and now they're just kind of playing out in digital spaces? How do you weigh this?
Yeah, so I'm a developmental scientist, and so I really do look at how, different stages of development and how they happen, what they look like. And I do see our observations and fears of how kids are using technologies, um, as they are very similar to our fears around kids just dating many decades back. I study mostly adolescence. The word adolescent is actually not even that old, and it's kind of an outgrowth of marketing from the 1950s. Um, but this idea of a teenager, um, and and so I think that for many years, many decades, we've been concerned about, young people and gaining more autonomy, rebelling against the older generations. These are, age old concerns, and they're part of the developmental process of figuring out your identity, figuring out your role in the world and what kind of world you want, and pushing back against the world you see. Um, and so today we have new technologies to do that expressing, and and yeah, that self-expression. And so I think, it's kind of compounded. We have these new technologies that we're kind of afraid of because they're unknown, and then youth are using them to push against, the status quo, which they've always done. And sometimes we forget that. Sometimes we feel like, oh, it's the technology that's doing this, it's disrupting, it's making teens, more rebellious, or, more self-centered, or whatever it is. However we characterize teens today, it's the technology doing it, but really it's the interaction between these developmental processes that precede today's technologies, and the technologies themselves. So a lot of the work that I do looks at that interaction between how certain technologies, certain platforms, for instance, certain social media platforms, how they are designed, and what actions they allow or encourage, and what they don't allow or they discourage, and how does that interact with an adolescent's growing sense of self and the way they connect with peers and so on. And so I think really understanding that interaction is very important to understanding what's going on. It's not just the technology, it's not just the young person, but it's really that interaction.
So is it then that offline life seems, I don't know, less compelling in expressing that developing sense of self? Do they feel like the reach is greater on these online platforms? Like, is there some sort of fundamental tension between like a sense of being connected digitally and through actual connection kind of embodied in the world?
That's a really good question. I think, first of all, the, young people's social lives are online to a large degree. And so it's just the context of youth. And often there isn't that much distinction between online and offline. That's just kind of seamlessly going in and out of both. But I do think that, something that you said about that audience, that greater reach, that there is something there, for young people, for everybody really. But imagine, you're as a teen expressing yourself in the context of your immediate environment and your school, your family, versus potentially, maybe not in reality, but potentially reaching a much larger audience. All of a sudden the stakes are raised. The excitement and the fear are charged to a degree that they aren't, when you're just expressing yourself in a an offline context. So, yeah, I do think that there's something interesting that goes on that, amplifies the everyday challenges and excitements and fears around identity expression for youth.
Is the idea of screen time in and of itself altogether less important or less impactful than thinking about like meaningful versus meaningless time on screens? Is all screen time created equal? How do you weigh this?
Yeah, absolutely not. So, in my book, Technology's Child, I make this distinction between self directed and non self directed digital experiences. And a lot of the times when I'm speaking with parents and teachers, I invariably get the question of how much time should my 6-year-old be on their tablet, or, when should I get my kid a phone, or, very concrete questions. And as a parent myself, I very much empathize with those questions. When you're a parent, there's just so much guilt and uncertainty, and you just want some concrete answers. How much time is so much easier than, oh, what kind of time and what should they be doing? But unfortunately, it really does matter. The meaningfulness, as you said, I think meaningfulness is important. The concept of self-directed I use because it embodies this idea of agency. And so ideally, what you want is to have a technology experience where you're in the driver's seat and that you're calling the shots. You have the agency, rather than the other way around, where you just feel like you've lost the last 30 minutes of your life scrolling through Instagram or TikTok, and you were not in control. You weren't even aware of what you're doing. But you were just kind of had fallen down a rabbit hole of, you know kind of mindless scrolling. And so yeah, it's really that distinction between agency and not having that agency, which is behind this idea of self-directed digital experiences. So I say that's, I think that's one thing to have front and center, is thinking of, what does a self-directed experience look like? What sort of designs lend themselves to having the user maintain their agency and their sense, of being in the driver's seat? So that's important. But there is something about time, generally. My son is 8, and I see a change in him. If he's been on his tablet for, over an hour, his eyes do start to glaze over a little bit. Of course, it's going to be different for each child. And I'm sure even your listeners and maybe you yourself, I certainly feel if I'm binging a show, after a certain amount of time, I can start to feel a little ick feeling. And so I don't want to dismiss time completely. I think it is relevant. But I think thinking of both time and quality together is really important.
And to push back a little bit on the time piece, is the biggest problem less about overuse, but rather that our use is typically boring and uncreative and how we're going about it? Like, is it
Absolutely.
consumption versus, say, creation? I could sit in front of my computer, and if I'm on my digital audio workstation playing around with a synthesizer, I could do this for 12 hours and really not have that glazed over effect. My mind's kind of
Hmm.
bubbling with ideas. Versus if I'm just scrolling through Instagram or binging on Netflix,
No, I think
I
that's a
definitely feel
really
the
good.
glazing. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really good distinction. And it kind of taps into um, the idea of flow,
Mhm.
Mihai's idea of flow. And, if you're totally absorbed in an activity where you are, exerting your own agency, you're creating something or you're learning something. Yeah, you could spend 8 hours and maybe your eyes are glazing over because you're so intently concentrated, but you are absorbed because you are learning, you're creating. Actually, my son Oliver did that recently with my mother, his grandmother. They spent maybe 6 hours one day editing a short video about the adventures of Stickman. Um, and I that was much more time than Oliver usually spends with a screen, but he was doing it with his grandmother. He was creating a story. They storyboarded it all out. They found the music, they edited it. It took forever, but they were in control of this experience. They were learning, they were having fun together. That's very different than spending 6 hours just watching, YouTube videos of someone else playing Minecraft. Um, which he also likes to do.
So is it that technology doesn't put us in that zone of proximal development where we're kind of on the edge of our abilities and getting to flow? Is it that technology's maybe too easy? Where do we stand on this? Or is it just again, it's built for consumption, not so much co-creation in all instances?
Yes, so much of the technology that we consume is consumption based. Even, I mean, not even, but maybe even particularly social media platforms, which ostensibly they are, you can produce, you can post, you can create. But I study teens a lot in their experiences with social media. The vast majority of them are not posting. And actually, that's something I've noticed change over the last 20 years. When I first started observing and talking with teens, they did a lot more posting on Facebook than they do now on Instagram and TikTok. It's much more just scrolling through. Um, and it's they're scrolling through algorithmically curated feeds instead of chronologically curated feeds, and the algorithm is really optimized to just capture their attention, and just kind of put them into that, and they and us, anyone, it really doesn't matter what age, but place us into this sort of zoning out, just mindless scrolling. And actually the term mindless scrolling is one that comes up over and over again in my interviews with youth. Um, and yeah, so, and again, it comes down to the design of these sites, how the what the algorithm prioritizes, just the ability to infinitely scroll. That's not something that's been around for the whole life of social media. That's a relatively new feature. And so the kinds of behaviors that features such as infinite scroll, algorithmically curated feeds that give rise to are not ones that really support that sense of agency and calling the shots. It's more like I'm being led, and I'm kind of zoning out.
How concerned are you when it comes to algorithmic content curation with the erosion of kind of shared cultural connection or shared meaning? Before, you would turn on the 8 p.m. TV program, and it was the same 8 p.m. TV program that everyone would watch. You'd go into the office the next day, and you'd all talk about that episode of Frasier or Friends or Seinfeld or whatever it was that you were watching. Does that happen less when you kind of can exist in your own bubble of curated content, very niche and personalized to you? We talk a lot about personalization in technology, like
Hmm.
it's a great end state, but is that a great end state? Do we require some degree of shared cultural artifacts?
Whew, that is a really good question. Yeah, I mean, I can see making an argument for both sides, actually. The current state of, if you just look at the US and our social fabric, I mean, starting back, I mean, even preceding Robert Putnam's book, Bowling Alone, we have been worried about the fragmentation, the severing of those social bonds, like bowling leagues and different, going to church and things like that. Um, we don't have a Walter Cronkite giving us the news every evening, or even three anchors. We have, we find our news on social media, or whatever seems to align with our perspectives. And so the result is we can be having very different experiences. Um, and I think there's something concerning about that when you zoom out and look at, you know, shared understanding, and you can even look at our political landscape and just the degree of intense polarization that we have right now. I think at least some of it can be traced to our very particular media diets. Um, so there's that I think is definitely an area for concern. The whole idea of, there's not just this one show that we're all watching, like Frasier and things like that. That I see how teens are, they develop their own pockets of shared culture. They do a lot of what they're doing on social media is communicating through memes, and
Mhm.
developing a really rich language, actually, cultural language, where they're both expressing themselves and relating their identities to this shared culture, that I find, very creative and really interesting. And they're watching shows on Netflix or Hulu or wherever, that may not have been possible to be produced in an era of just prime time TV. I'm not sure that Euphoria would have had a 8 or 9 p.m. slot on NBC. I'm not sure. Um, and I think that's kind of great. That part I like.
To what extent do you think things like the endless feed and content curation to your, own taste and needs through an algorithm, how much of that has damaged our ability to tolerate boredom?
Oh yeah. I think it's had a huge effect. And it's something that, there are a lot of books that have been written recently about this idea of, just every single moment of our downtime, it's possible to focus elsewhere outside of our own thoughts. And I think, in some respects that can be good. A lot of our own thoughts, when we're left to our own thoughts, a lot of what we do is ruminate, and that's not so great. But just sitting with our own thoughts, those are opportunities for us to consolidate memories, and to figure out what we think about something that just happened, or many things that happened, to figure out what we're going to do next. This is particularly important in the context of child development. Just the ability to um, experience boredom and then figure out how you're going to get out of that boredom on your own, and redirect your attention. Those are actually really important skills for children to develop. And if they're always, they have something that is always on hand for them to do, they never have to figure that out. And part of this is, it's on parents and teachers and other people in children's lives to help them, be bored, find moments of boredom, and figure out how they're going to get out of it. I try to do that with my son. If he says that he's bored, the obvious thing would be to just turn something on the TV. But we have pretty clear rules about that during the day. So he has to figure things out. Sometimes it takes a while. But I do think it's an important skill to develop, and one that is very, very easy not to develop in this day and age.
I ask because I'm interested in talking a little bit more about youth creativity and how our tech tools affect that. I mean, is boredom kind of the seedbed for a lot of creativity? Do you have to be able to sit alone and kind of work through things by yourself without, music playing in the background or scrolling through TikTok? Does having less tolerance for being bored have a negative effect on our ability to be creative?
Um, well, there's a lot of different ideas about what undergirds creativity. And I am not a creativity scholar. However, I have read a lot about creativity, and um, I would say, this idea of the lone creative genius is probably one that we overblow a little bit in our society. A lot of creativity happens and even if you read about creative individuals, a lot of their creativity happens in a very social way, where through conversation. And so I think that a lot of creativity isn't just someone holding up and just reflecting for a long period of time. However, I do think that the ability to stick with a task, even when it gets complicated and hard and you really have to struggle through um, some complex thoughts to get to that other side of a creative breakthrough. um, that's really important, and something that is not very comfortable for us to do, to just sit and grapple with something for an extended period of time. And especially, I would say, in today's media landscape, we consume things in such small doses, such small fragments. Even our ability to sit through an entire movie is sometimes, a lot of people are also scrolling through their phone while watching a movie, because it just seems like too much to just focus on one thing for 2 hours. Um, but that's really required, and to produce any sort of meaningful work. There is a certain amount of time investment required, and energy, and just sort of sticking with it, that is required. And that does concern me, our ability to do that. It's too easy for us not to have to do that these days.
I recently read Boswell's Life of Johnson, and that book really very much seems like a defense of great friendships and great
Mm,
groups being kind of the basis for creative thinking or problem solving, right? That Johnson was surrounded by this group of people that he was able to collaborate with or debate or work with, and that was kind of the basis of, yes, he is this kind of lone creative genius, but maybe he isn't to the same level that we see him, through time without his group, without his friends and partners. Do you I mean, is there something about kind of online collaboration or friendship that is lost from the in-person version of it? Is it a lesser form of connection, one-on-one? Where do you stand on this? Is it just a
mm.
different form of connection?
Yeah, that is a great question. Yeah, I mean, would we know so much and think so highly of Samuel Johnson if Boswell hadn't written that, his biography, and if he
Mhm.
hadn't spoken with all those other people and his friends? Yeah, if you like that, I highly recommend another book, Magnificent Rebels, about the late 18th century, early 19th century German intellectuals, German romantics. And again, you can see how they just fed off of each other. And so, yeah, if they were communicating online, well, a lot of them communicated through letter writing was huge. And I think they actually had some really important breakthroughs through letter writing. um, so yeah, I mean, my second book was actually about young people reading and writing fan fiction in online fan fiction communities. And we did a deep year-long online ethnography of different online fan fiction communities. And there's some pretty intense, deep collaborations that go on in those kinds of communities. And often they do spill out into offline, or they extend into offline um, interactions as well. And so, yeah, I think that certainly it's easy to have shallow interactions in online spaces. It probably takes a little bit more. There's a lot of writing around when you're removing a lot of the typical social cues of that we have in offline context. When you remove those, it does take more time. It takes more effort to form meaningful connections online, but it's not impossible. And I certainly have seen it happen in especially these, deep interest driven communities where people are really invested personally over the long haul, I think you can actually find some really meaningful collaborations in those spaces. Um, Now, if you zoom out and say, well, what percentage of people, what percentage of youth are participating in such communities, I would say it's probably a pretty small percentage, even though the possibility is there. Unfortunately, the vast majority of all of us, we're spending a lot of time scrolling through social media feeds.
Now, do you think now this is asking you to predict the future, so I know those answers are always tentative. Broad mainstream social media platforms, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, do you think they can give way to maybe smaller, more curated social groups, right? As opposed to logging into TikTok, you would log into, I don't know, your Discord group or server or whatever. Like, what is the role of small communities online? And do you see it to play a bigger role through time? Do you think it'll remain kind of a small piece of the internet? Because I see a lot of dissatisfaction with social media and people going to like things like
Yeah.
Telegraph or like WhatsApp chats or Discord servers, like or
Hmm.
private Facebook communities, small groups within the larger ecosystem.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. Uh, Certainly these smaller platforms have certainly grown in size. Uh, we recently published a paper on teens' use of Be Real, which seems to perhaps not be quite as popular as it was just a couple of years ago. But again, this idea of you know, if you have a certain number of friends, it just will say 50 plus rather than the exact count, trying to maintain smaller circles of friends. I think that that seems to be something that teens and adults, for that matter, crave. At the same time, there's something so compelling about going on to these large broadcast platforms just to see, the most popular
Mhm.
thing that's there. And so I don't see that those going away anytime soon, but I definitely see a huge dissatisfaction. Actually, one of our recent papers, um, in the title, it's just basically a quote from one of the teens about how bored they are on Instagram most of the time. They're just scrolling through boring content or irrelevant content just to get to something that is relevant that they can share with their friends. Um, so yeah, I think it'll be interesting. I think people are notoriously bad, myself included, at predicting the future, but it does seem right now that these smaller communities seem to be having greater prominence and popularity right now.
So in the scrolling to find something relevant or interesting, is it that I don't want to use the word desensitized. I don't think that's particularly accurate. Is it that we have such a tolerance, maybe is the word, for so many various forms of content, right? You might jump from a text-based comment to a video-based short form video. Maybe that'll take you to then a 20-minute YouTube video, right? We have so many different types of content. Is it a very diet that we're after? Do we want different forms of media? Is it just that people post the same thing and we're remarkably uncreative and kind of boring when we post on social media? Do you think AI would have some role in this? Would it be more entertaining to talk to some sycophantic chatbot that tells me how amazing I am and constantly compliments my ideas? Is it acceptance? Is it variety? Like, what is it that we're forging for when we're online in these communities?
Oh, I love the word foraging. I think that's really, yeah, I think that captures what we do, I think. So much of it comes down to the way we're wired for variable rewards. Um, so I mean, it's like when you open up your email, um,
Oh God.
Most of it is irrelevant and boring and or a drudge task, but
Mhm.
you never know. You might get that one email where you've gotten a grant or, whatever wonderful thing or
Mhm.
has happened. And I think it's the same thing with social media. And it's, social media platforms, they hire a lot of psychologists. They know exactly how we're wired for variable rewards. So they can get away with a ton of irrelevant, boring content because you just never know. You might be one swipe away, one scroll away from something really interesting, really relevant, and God forbid you miss it because then you're not in the know.
Mhm.
And I think that's, a really big driver for us on social media.
How much do the incentive structures of what we're chasing and perhaps what we binge online change as we age, right? When I'm younger, it might be social media and acceptance gaming on Fortnite or something like this. But as you get older, it might give way to, I don't know, online gambling or perhaps the consumption of pornography. Like, where are these kind of the same impulses that are still raging into adulthood? Or, how is how do our incentives change as we age online? Are we after kind of the same base things? Is it the dopamine hit or is it something else?
I think the dopamine hit is, that's a constant. It's very consistent that across the lifespan, I would say that we like those dopamine hits. Um, my work is very influenced by the late psychologist Eric Erickson, and the way he depicted development throughout the lifespan. He said that each stage of development there's sort of a spotlight on one particular aspect. So for teens, it's identity development. For emerging adults, it's developing intimate relationships. However, it's not the fact that once you leave adolescence, you're done with identity, but that follows you through so that you're always figuring out who you are. It's just, it may not be the developmental focus at that moment. So I think that's actually really helpful for thinking about what we're looking for and what we're experiencing online. um, all of these things are there. We're looking to express ourselves and get validation from others. It's just where's the focus and what are we most concerned about and how do we react to it. So perhaps when we're in our 30s and 40s, we're still looking for that validation that a teen would look for, but perhaps we're also looking for other things as well, maybe professional recognition and things like that. So, I like to think of it as, we're all kind of marching through with these same sorts of concerns and interests. It's just a matter of where the spotlight is at any given age.
In your book, App Generation, you and Howard Gardner explored how digital life affects young people's identities, intimacy, imagination. I'm interested if you could speak a little bit more on the role of fan fiction communities in shaping the way young people express themselves creatively and form their identities. And then maybe something along the lines of I find it interesting that aspects of youth creativity like visual arts have risen over the past few decades while others like creative writing have declined. I guess what's the overlap of all these different types of strains that I'm getting at here?
Yeah, so the fan fiction work I was I did that after the app generation with my collaborator Cecilia Aragon at the University of Washington. Um, and that was really interesting because, in the app generation that I wrote with Howard, we pointed out a lot of concerns that we had around how young people were engaging with technology from a creative perspective. Some of the positive things that we were seeing, as you said, were with respect to the visual arts. And it's really hard with this to know, what exactly are the influences, what's the bigger influence and not. But we were seeing a trend in our research towards writing that was not quite as interesting and a little bit more formulaic over a 20-year time frame, which we, as educators in an education school, we were pretty sure that that had less to do with technology and more to do with the way writing is taught in schools. Whereas the visual art that we analyzed was becoming, more multimedia, more interesting, seemed to like be uh, pushing boundaries in a way that the writing wasn't. And that I think we can probably attribute to just, kids' exposure through the internet to more a larger range of visual production and more models. And so I think that there's some really interesting differences there. Um, that now, with respect to fan fiction, that's now again in the writing domain. I think it's important to note that, relatively few young people or people in general are writing fan fiction or reading fan fiction. It's a pretty niche area. But within that space, there's a lot of interesting work going on. There's a lot of like not interesting writing and not particularly good writing as well, for sure. Um, but I was just really fascinated by, first of all, the amount of time and commitment and passion that young people bring to writing their own fan fiction stories based on whether it's Harry Potter or whatever their favorite source is. How they extend it in new ways. It's really amazing, and also how they give feedback on other people's fan fiction works. Um, so I would love to be able to bring the passion that small group, relatively speaking, small group of youth, how they bring that passion. I would love to be able to bottle that in some way and bring that to a larger group of youth to pursue their creative pursuits. Because certainly being online in the context of all of the technologies that we have, editing software, music production, all this stuff that we have, I think we have such potential today to express ourselves in so many different creative modalities. But whether we do or not, that's a much different question.
Do you think those trends could continue to grow in the face of generative AI, where it may be easier than ever before to write a few lines of fan fiction, then I don't know, plug it into Sora, and now I'm watching a 30-minute short episode of something based on what I wrote or what I developed? How much of that, like the co-creation of media, will continue to develop in the age of AI, where we're able to, I don't know, extend a book 3 more chapters based on the direction we wanted it to go? And is that a net positive, or is that a net negative when we can, I guess, continue to develop fiction at our leisure?
Yeah. Um, so I do think there's tremendous potential for co-creation with AI. Um, in many different creative pursuits. When it comes to writing, as a writer myself, I, I maybe it is because I am a writer. That's one where I think, oh no, no, you can't write with AI. But of course, I think that's, I don't know. I think that's just um, a product of, the way I go about my writing and how I see the task of writing being done and how it should be done. Um, but I more easily, because I'm not, for instance, a musician or a visual artist, I could, it's easier for me to see how you could use AI as a co-creator in that respect. Um, and perhaps, if with a little bit more imagination, I can also see it with writing. But I think I'm excited about the possibilities for co-creation through AI. I'm also, when it comes to kids, I'm really excited about, um, often it's difficult for kids to get started. They might have a cool idea in mind, but if they go to actually implement that idea, they quickly get discouraged because what they have in their mind, they just can't translate very easily into whatever it is, whatever medium it is they have imagined. And with AI, that makes it a little bit more possible. So the late MIT researcher Seymour Papert talked about technology lowering the floor for entry into creative pursuits or any sort of learning pursuit. And I think that AI really does have the potential to lower that floor. He also talked about the ability of technology to raise the ceiling of what's possible to create. And so, yeah, I really do see that possibility with AI.
What are we to make of? I mean, there's a slew of studies demonstrating this in blind taste tests of artwork, of written content, both poetry and prose. People tend to prefer AI generated content over the human generated content, even if they state that they do not like AI generated content. Um, I saw a recent study, I think, out of MIT where they compared human only content, AI only content, human content edited by an AI, and then AI content edited by humans. And overwhelmingly, the results skewed towards people's preferences being on the AI front rather than purely human created. Do we
Yeah,
just do we just like bad art and bad writing, or
we
is AI
certainly
really good
do
at
like our fair.
mimicking?
Yeah, so this is something, this idea of the regression toward the mean that I do worry about, and I have worried about before AI, of just kind of liking the safe thing, the thing that is looks familiar, that's easy to digest. Um, I think that's very common. And for an actual creative breakthrough to come through it, it takes a little bit of, certain people saying, no, we should pay attention to this, even if it's, something that we don't enjoy, whether it's like Schoenberg's new piece, atonal music or something. Maybe it doesn't sound good to us, but it's important and we should appreciate it. So I think it does take, um, us as a society to be able to reflect on what should we be paying attention to from a creative perspective. So there's a difference between what we prefer versus what we recognize as having value, creative value. And those two things are different. And so I'm not really surprised, I guess, so much that a lot of people would prefer something that's AI generated, because it's usually kind of, safe and a little bit boring and but easy to digest. But I don't think that means that we're going to get away with, we're going to move away from the human created um, uh, material and our value for that.
Is it more worrisome then that people cannot tell the difference in many cases between the two, where we misidentify human created work as AI generated and AI generated work as human created, and not being able to tell the difference between two? This isn't so much in the writing domain as much as I'm talking about works of art and this blind taste test that I'm referring to.
Yeah, it is concerning that if you can't tell the difference. I think, well, I hope that we will be able to figure out a way to signal what is human created versus what is AI created. Um, I say that now, but maybe in the future, we'll look back and say, oh, that distinction is irrelevant. Maybe it's, it's going to, we're going to start to move in the direction of co-creation so much that it won't matter, or it won't even be possible to disentangle. I'm not sure. But at this given moment in time, it does seem important to be able to tell the difference. There's something that we value about something that's been generated by a human versus something not. And it seems, at least for me, that that's an important distinction to be able to make.
Okay, so we only have a few minutes left. So what I'll do is I'll mention something related to our conversation that we've had up to this point, a topic, concept, a skill, and you can tell me if you think it's overrated, underrated, properly rated, and maybe a brief explanation as to why you feel this way.
Okay, sounds good.
Screen time as a metric for healthy tech use.
So that I think is overrated.
Handwriting skills over the next 10 years.
Oh my goodness. Well, this as a lefty who always struggled with handwriting, I do not care about handwriting. That's totally overrated in my opinion.
I mean, I love handwriting, and I picked up one of these Remarkable tablets. Again, Remarkable does not sponsor the show in any way. One thing I do like about it is, when I go to make my straight lines, if I hold the pen there for a second, it will automatically straighten the line. And then once I handwrite the text, I can go handwriting to typed text. Just one click translates it right over. At that point, I care less and less about my handwriting if I can automatically turn it into typed text as opposed to my handwritten slop, because it's awful.
Yeah, no, I know that I'm sure. Well, when I was a teacher, I know I had many colleagues who really emphasize the importance of handwriting, and I know that it has a place. I just personally hated handwriting, and I had to write with a cartridge pen.
Mm.
And this is not something that I am, you know, working with my son every night, for instance, versus we are working on reading every night. So, yeah, I think we'll figure it out. I think we'll be just fine as a human species without having to produce beautiful cursive writing.
The concept of a digital native.
Oh, I don't like that phrase for a lot of reasons, but just the idea that youth are born knowing just instinctively how to use technology, I don't think is particularly helpful. Um, youth are very Children are very good at learning anything. They're not afraid to make mistakes. And so it's very easy for them to learn how to use technology. So just, through pure trial and error. That is very different than knowing how to use a technology well or ethically, responsibly. And so the idea of the digital native just totally glosses over that distinction.
Teenagers learning to code.
Oof. Well, I mean, so I teach in an information school where we're talking about no code. Maybe is learning to code obsolete now with AI? So I don't know about that one. I'm not a computer scientist. I'm not a computer science teacher. Um, and I guess that kind of gets to the question of how much should we really understand about the technology that we're using? Should we just be able to use it on the most superficial level, or should we really understand what's going on underneath the hood? And so, should teens know how to code? Should they not? I think it's useful to know how our underlying technologies work, for sure. But part of that is also understanding the ethical dimensions as well. And so knowing how to code, very important, but knowing, the whole ecosystem of how, um, code happens and who's creating the code and for what purposes, that's equally as important.
So is it kind of a tension between deep technical knowledge and having just kind of a diverse array of mental models pulled from many disciplines applied more generally? Which do you weigh as more important, or do you think they kind of exist in balance, like you need both for either one to work?
Well, I think there's a value in knowing something deeply. It's just the idea of the T, it's good to be a generalist, but also at least to be able to go deep on one thing. So I don't know. I definitely see a value of being able to go deep into, and it might be code, it might be something else, but at the very minimum, have that general broad interest, I think, is an understanding of the technologies around us, I think, is important.
Three more overrated, underrated, and then a few wrap up questions. Gamification in education.
Hmm.
Not game based learning, but
Hmm.
gamification.
Well, yeah. So that's the difference. So game-based learning, great. Gamification, I would say overrated, but could be. I've done a lot of research on digital badges in education. Um, I think there's a space for. I mean, already school is gamified. um, we get stickers, rewards, all of these things. Um, a little bit of that I think is fine, but wholesale gamification, no. I think that, it places emphasis too much on external motivation.
The role of YouTube for learning.
I think that might be underrated in certain circles. But actually, I think a lot of the teachers, the parents, and researchers that I speak with do recognize the huge value of. I mean, there's so much learning that can go on YouTube, pretty much anything. So I would say maybe a air on underrated, with the recognition that probably lots of people do appreciate that.
So semi properly
Semi,
rated,
yeah, maybe,
maybe a little under.
yeah.
Smartphone bans.
Whew, that I okay, well, that's very charged, and not a ton of well, there's more research coming out. So I more have there's a little bit of research suggesting that um, smartphone bans have a positive net effect in schools. They make life a little bit easier for teachers, and I can certainly empathize with that as a former teacher and a current university teacher who is always trying to compete against the phone and whatever's on my students' laptops. Um, but I think there's a lot of research being done right now because there's a lot of bans that are happening across the country. So I think it'll be really interesting to see where the research nets out. My gut instinct is that um, banning phones from the classroom environment is probably a good idea. Um, there's probably a net positive to be gained through greater attention on the lesson versus whatever source of knowledge the smartphone can provide. That's my intuition based on the work that I've done over the last few decades.
To wrap up, I got a question on emerging trends. Going to ask you to do some myth busting and then maybe some of your hopes for the future. So, looking ahead, what emerging technologies or digital trends do you believe will most maybe shape next generation's childhood and education? Are there any upcoming developments like AR, VR, more advanced AI, something else that make you particularly excited or particularly concerned about their potential impact on youth?
Well, right now I'm really focused on generative AI tools and how they're being introduced into the classroom. And, I think there's tremendous potential for um, greater personalized learning and just personalized forms of engaging students who might not otherwise be engaged. But I'm also concerned about, um, you know, again, taking the easy route and just using AI to replace hard things, hard tasks like writing and things like that. So I think that's probably, in my mind, the most important trend right now to observe is just how generative AI tools are going to be and are being introduced into schools and teachers' processes and students' processes.
If you could debunk one myth or misconception about kids and technology that still persists in public debate, what would that be?
Oh, well, it seems that, this idea of screen time, just screen time being bad, that seems to be just sort of an accepted idea. I think I would I would go for that one because again, it's not just the screen time, but it's really the quality of what young people are doing. Um, I might have a couple of years ago gone for the social media is destroying teens. I would have maybe gone for that one, and I think that that's overblown, saying that social media is destroying a generation, the way Jonathan Haidt might say it in his book, The Anxious Generation. Um, but, there is a lot of evidence showing that for a lot of teens, social media is stressful and it does at least play a role in mental health challenges such as depression and anxiety. So that one I think is one that I've changed. I think there's a lot to be concerned about when it comes to teens and social media, even if I wouldn't go to the extent of saying that it's ruining an entire generation.
I was going to include that book in the overrated, underrated section, but decided to play nice. So I'm glad you addressed it anyway. Um, so I guess more on a personal note to wrap up, you're a researcher, you're a parent. What gives you hope about the future of youth in this kind of increasingly digitized world? What keeps you motivated to continue?
Oh, well, I think it's the teens. I get emails from teens who are concerned about, you know, their experiences with technology and they want to make them better. Um, I work with a lot of teens. We have a youth advisory board at the University of Washington, and they're a group of teens that we meet with regularly to explore their experiences with technology and to envision new technology futures. And they are just so full of fantastic ideas, and just knowing that they and also the undergrads that I teach at the information school, they are going to go out and join the workforce, work for these companies, maybe create their own companies, and I know that a lot of them are going to try to make these technologies better. And in the meantime, it's just so much fun working with young people to explore what technology can do and how it can do better than it currently is, and that really keeps me going.
That was going to be my last question, but your response made me think of another one. You were talking about how we shouldn't necessarily outsource what's hard to technology, like writing or creating. How do you stand on maybe outsourcing some of that self-regulation, right? I have an app that locks down all my social media apps and I can't unlock it until, you know, the end of the workday or whatever.
Yeah. I think that's a very an individual thing there. Self-regulation. Ideally, you want to be able to um, develop your own ability to self-regulate. One does, and especially that's a very important skill to develop in children. Um, but you mentioned earlier the zone of proximal development in Vygotsky. So this idea of scaffolding, maybe having that lockout app can be a helpful scaffold to develop self-regulation. And then there's also the concept of fading. Maybe there comes a time when you don't need that in place anymore, and you can kind of get rid of the scaffold and keep the good habits. So I think there's certainly um, a place for those kinds of tools, self-regulation tools, self-control tools, they're often called, as a scaffold. Ideally, you'd want to fade, but it doesn't have to be immediate.
Katie, thank you.